I sat near the back of the wedding hall, barely able to see the altar through the heads in front of me. My name wasn't on the reserved seating. No one had mentioned it, but I got the message clearly. I wasn't meant to be part of the show. I clutched the corsage Ava had handed me with a distracted smile hours earlier. It was pale pink, delicate and perfect, like everything she planned, like everything I was no longer part of. The music swelled. Cameras turned toward the front. No one turned to look at me. It wasn't the seat that hurt. It was the silence, the absence of recognition. I had raised her on my own, given up everything to make sure she had a chance at the life she dreamed of. And now I was here, in the shadows, invisible at the moment that was supposed to mean everything. When her new husband took the microphone later for his speech, I expected more of the same. Polished words, pretty acknowledgments, a list of names that wouldn't include mine. But then he looked straight past the crowd, his voice trembling, and he said, "There's someone in this room who carried this family before it even existed, who gave everything without asking for anything back, and she's sitting in the very last row." He turned toward me, and in that moment, I saw his eyes fill with tears. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Long before the wedding, before the tension and silence, it was just the two of us, me and Ava, against the world. I was 29 when her father died in a factory accident, and Ava was barely 6 months old. There was no inheritance, no backup plan, just a one-bedroom apartment, a night shift librarian job, and a baby girl who needed everything I had. And I gave it. We had this tiny ritual every night after dinner. I'd read to her from old fairy tales at the library, even before she could understand the words. I'd rock her in my arms with a tattered copy of The Secret Garden or Charlotte's Web, whispering the stories into her dreams. On weekends, we'd stretch every dollar into something magical. A picnic at the park with sandwiches wrapped in foil, homemade costumes for Halloween. Ava was a ladybug one year, wings made from wire hangers and red felt. The other moms laughed, but Ava twirled in her outfit like she was the belle of a ball. She grew up knowing how to make things beautiful with very little, because that's how I raised her. She never knew how many dinners I skipped, so she'd have enough, or how I cried quietly into my pillow the year I couldn't afford her school trip. But she never missed a field trip, never went to school in old shoes, never felt poor. That was my job, and I did it proudly. By the time she was in high school, Ava started showing signs of a fire I'd always prayed she'd have. She got straight A's, joined debate, won local scholarships. When she got into Columbia, we both cried. She stood on that acceptance letter like it was a ladder to a whole new life. I packed her bags, sewed her initials into her laundry bag, and hugged her goodbye on the bus platform. I didn't cry until I got home and saw her empty bedroom. Even then, I told myself, this is what you worked for. This is what love looks like. At first, she called often, every Sunday. She'd tell me about her classes, her professors, the city. She struggled sometimes, but she always said, "I'm doing it, Mom, because of you." I'd make her favorite lemon tea over the phone and listen like I was right there with her. But slowly, things began to shift. Her calls became shorter. She stopped coming home for Thanksgiving, then for Christmas. She told me she was networking and building her brand. I didn't know what those words really meant, but I smiled and said I understood. After all, she was building the life I never could. The first time I met Noah, the man she'd eventually marry, was through a video call. He seemed polite, smart, a little too polished maybe. He called me ma'am, which made me feel ancient, but Ava beamed next to him like she'd found someone who truly matched her pace. I told her I was happy for her, and I meant it. She didn't ask for much about the wedding, at least not at first. I assumed, maybe foolishly, that I would help plan it, that we'd go dress shopping together, that I'd hold her veil while she cried happy tears. Instead, I got a save the date in the mail with a typed note that read, "Details to follow, love you." Still, I wasn't worried. I chalked it up to stress. She was busy. That's what I kept telling myself. I started looking for dresses on my own. Something tasteful, not too loud. Ava had always liked when I wore soft colors. I bought a sky blue gown and matching shoes, had my hair trimmed. I even treated myself to a manicure, something I hadn't done in years. The day before the wedding, she called. Just a short call. "Mom," she said, "just dress nicely, okay? Nothing floral, nothing too bright, just simple." Her voice wasn't cruel, but it wasn't warm either. It was controlled, measured. I paused. "Of course," I said. "Simple? Got it." When the call ended, I sat quietly on the couch, staring at the dress I'd picked. Suddenly, it felt wrong. I folded it and drove to the store to buy something plainer, something beige and safe. I told myself it was her day, not mine. I didn't want to be a distraction, but somewhere deep inside, something had begun to shift. The girl who used to twirl in my handmade costumes now seemed embarrassed by me. And for the first time in decades, I felt unsure of my place in her world. It was a Sunday afternoon just before Eva's engagement party. She'd flown in for a quick visit, her first in nearly a year. I'd spent the week cleaning the apartment top to bottom, baking her favorite orange loaf cake, and setting out the old photo albums I thought she might enjoy flipping through. She walked in wearing a crisp white coat, her heels clicking against my linoleum floor like she didn't belong there anymore. Still, I hugged her tight. She smelled like some expensive perfume I couldn't name. Her hair was sleeker than I remembered. Her nails were done in a neutral, glossy color. Everything about her looked carefully curated and completely different from the little girl who used to run barefoot through our tiny backyard covered in finger paint. We sat down for tea. I poured hers in the chipped china cup I'd saved for special occasions. She took one polite sip and then glanced toward the living room mirror. "Mom," she said, tilting her head, "I forgot to mention, can you please not wear anything with big prints to the party? Especially not florals." I blinked. "You mean like the blue dress I wore to your graduation?" She smiled faintly, trying to soften the blow. "It's just the aesthetic. We're going for minimal and elegant. I just don't want anyone to stand out too much in the photos. You know how everything ends up online these days." I nodded slowly. "Of course. I'll find something more neutral." She didn't say thank you, just looked relieved. It wasn't the request itself that hurt. I understood wanting a clean color scheme, wanting everything to look perfect. It was the subtext, the way her voice didn't carry warmth, the way she said anyone, but only meant me. Like I was something she needed to manage. I looked down at my cardigan, a soft lavender one with tiny hand-embroidered daisies I'd added years ago. It suddenly felt silly, childish, like I'd overdressed for my own life. I smiled and changed the subject, asking about Noah's family. She lit up then, talking about his mother, a museum curator, and his sister, a fashion consultant. I listened, nodding, but a quiet chill settled over me. When she left later that evening, she hugged me quickly, barely touching my shoulder. I stood in the doorway long after her Uber drove off, the cold settling into my bones even though it was only October. That night, I opened my closet and stared at the floral dresses hanging in a row. They were cheerful, colorful. Most of them handmade or altered by me over the years. They didn't cost much, but they made me feel good. Seen. I pulled each one out, folded them carefully, and tucked them into a storage bin. Maybe I was being overly sensitive. Maybe Ava was just nervous. Weddings were stressful. I told myself all of this while packing away clothes that had once made me feel like myself. Still, a quiet question kept surfacing. Since when did my presence feel like a problem? At the engagement party, I wore a beige dress with a simple neckline and no jewelry. I stood near the drink table while Ava's soon-to-be mother-in-law toasted the happy couple. People snapped pictures, laughed in small circles, talked about the floral arrangements and the rooftop venue. No one asked who I was. Ava introduced me once, to Noah's aunt, and even then it was a quick, "This is my mom, Helen." No stories, no warmth. Not the woman who raised her alone, who skipped meals so she could go on school trips, who stayed up late sewing sequins onto prom dresses. Just my mom. The aunt smiled politely. "How lovely to meet you." I nodded and smiled too. I had a glass of punch in my hand but hadn't taken a sip. I felt like I was watching my own life happen from behind glass. On the way home, I sat quietly in the back of the rideshare car, clutching a small party favor, a lavender sachet with their initials tied in silk ribbon. I remember turning it over in my hands, thinking how pretty it was, how it smelled like everything I wasn't allowed to be anymore. That night, I tucked it in my nightstand drawer right next to a photo of Ava at age 6, covered in dirt, grinning wildly with a missing front tooth and daisies in her hair. That was the first time I truly felt it, the shift. I didn't know what was coming yet, but something in my chest tightened, like my daughter was slowly becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. The weeks leading up to the wedding blurred together, not from excitement, but from a strange, quiet ache that followed me everywhere. I wasn't excluded outright. I was included just enough to keep up appearances. Ava sent the occasional update, a dress photo, a venue snapshot, a menu choice. But it always came as a forwarded message. No phone calls, no real conversation. No, "What do you think, Mom?" She wasn't being cruel. That's what made it worse. It was all so polite, so polished, like I was no longer her mother, but a distant relative she needed to acknowledge, not truly embrace. One afternoon, she messaged, "We finalized the ceremony seating. You'll be at table 8. That was it. No comment about who I'd be sitting with. No, "We wanted you up close." Just an administrative update like I was receiving a spreadsheet, not an invitation to the most important day of her life. I tried to brush it off. Told myself again, she's busy. Weddings are overwhelming. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being managed instead of included. I called her a week before the wedding, just to hear her voice. She picked up, but she sounded rushed. "Hi, Mom, can I call you back? I'm in the middle of a tasting." I said, "Of course. Just wanted to hear how things are going." She hesitated. "Everything's great. Noah's mom has been a lifesaver. She's handling the floral designs, the table numbers. Honestly, I don't know what I'd do without her." There it was again. That sinking feeling, that sharp contrast. Ava wasn't just leaning on Noah's mother. She was adoring her, depending on her in the way she used to lean on me. I'd been replaced, and no one had the decency to say it out loud. I told her I loved her and hung up. She never called back. That weekend, I sat alone in my kitchen with a stack of old family photos, sorting through memories that suddenly felt so distant. There was Ava as a toddler, sitting on my lap with her hair in tiny pigtails, grinning with her whole face. Ava in middle school, holding a spelling bee trophy. Ava at prom, nervously checking her dress in the mirror while I adjusted the hem. All those moments, mine. And now I was just there. A placeholder in a beige dress. I remember walking to the local coffee shop the next morning, hoping to shake the feeling. The barista, a sweet girl named Tanya, greeted me warmly. She asked about the wedding. I told her it was coming up. She smiled and said, "You must be so involved, helping with all the details?" I forced a smile. "Not really, she's very independent." Tanya laughed. "Still, she must be calling you nonstop. I know my mom would be losing her mind if I didn't include her in everything." I nodded. "She's got it under control." But the truth hit me like a wave the moment I stepped outside. Ava wasn't calling. She wasn't asking. She wasn't leaning. I wasn't part of her process. I was just part of her past. I spent the next few days moving through routines that felt emptier than usual. I baked a loaf of banana bread, my mother's old recipe, and realized halfway through that I had no one to give it to. I went to the library, picked out a novel, and found myself rereading the same paragraph over and over. Nothing held my focus anymore. I was fading in my own life. The real heartbreak wasn't in the moments Ava left me out. It was in the ways she didn't even seem to notice. There was no malice, just indifference. And somehow, that was worse. One night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, studying my reflection. The woman staring back looked tired, soft, kind, but uncertain. I pulled open the drawer where I had stashed that lavender wedding favor. The scent was still strong. It smelled like something expensive, something refined. It smelled like Ava's new life. I placed it back in the drawer and shut it. Somewhere deep inside, I started to accept what I hadn't wanted to believe. My daughter had outgrown me. Or at least, that's what she thought. The morning of the wedding, I woke up before the sun, nerves buzzing like static under my skin. I laid out the simple taupe dress I'd bought, steamed it twice, and polished the shoes that matched. I wore small pearl earrings, a gift from my mother decades ago, and a single gold bracelet Ava gave me for Mother's Day when she was 16. I didn't want to overdress, but I also didn't want to fade into the walls. I wanted to look respectable, pleasant, someone a daughter wouldn't mind being associated with. I arrived early. The venue was a modern chapel with soaring glass windows and perfectly trimmed hedges. I stood outside for a moment, adjusting the tiny corsage Ava had arranged for me. It was tied with a thin ivory ribbon and matched the bridesmaids' bouquets. That small detail gave me hope. Maybe she did think of me after all. I smiled at the greeter stationed at the entrance. He had a clipboard and a radio earpiece. "Name?" he asked. "Helen Waverly," I said. "Mother of the bride." He glanced down his list. His brow furrowed. I don't see you on the front family seating. 1 second. He stepped aside, speaking quietly into his earpiece. I felt heat rush to my cheeks. Guests streamed past, laughing, fixing dresses, snapping photos. I clutched my purse tighter. After a minute, he returned. "Sorry about that, ma'am. You're in row F, right this way." Row F. I followed him silently. It wasn't the back row, but it was far from the front. From where I sat, I could barely see the arch of flowers where Ava would say her vows. The reserved signs near the front had names. Noah's parents, siblings, extended family. Even the stepmother of his cousin had a labeled seat. Mine was blank. I sat down, keeping my posture upright, hands folded in my lap. I scanned the crowd. Everyone was polished, glowing. A few turned to glance at me. Not out of recognition, just curiosity. A woman in a designer dress whispered to the man beside her, likely wondering who I was. No one approached me. No one introduced themselves. I was invisible. A familiar voice chirped from a few rows up, "Ava's godmother, Dana." I waved gently, but she didn't see me. Then the ceremony music began. The crowd rose. Noah entered with his groomsmen, followed by the bridesmaids in satin champagne dresses. Ava appeared last, radiant, poised, arm-linked with Noah's father. Not mine, of course. My own father had passed years ago, and Ava hadn't asked anyone from our side to give her away. My heart swelled and sank at once. She looked stunning, like a woman from a bridal magazine, but her eyes never searched for mine. As she passed, she didn't glance toward the middle rows, didn't seek me out for a smile or reassurance. She walked past me like I was a stranger. The vows were beautiful. Her voice wavered as she promised forever. Noah's hand shook as he slipped the ring on her finger. The crowd sniffled. I blinked back tears. Not from pride, from something else I didn't want to name. The ceremony ended. Cameras flashed. The couple kissed. Applause erupted. Then everyone filed out to the cocktail area. I stood slowly, unsure whether to follow. No one came to get me. I followed the flow of guests and stood near a hedge, sipping flavored water from a glass I picked up off a tray. At the reception, I found my name on table 8. It was in the far corner by the speakers. The music was loud. Conversations at our table, mostly distant friends of Noah, were polite but surface level. No one asked how I knew the bride. Dinner was served, toasts were made, Noah's mother was thanked, extensively. Ava mentioned her best friend, her boss, her mentor, but not me. Then Noah stood for his speech, and for a second I thought, here it comes. More of the same, polished gratitude, vague sentiments, but then he said it. "There's one person here I need to thank. She's not sitting up front, but she's the reason this woman beside me became who she is today." The room went still. She taught Ava strength. She sacrificed everything for her. She raised her alone and never once asked for credit. I stopped breathing. "She's the quiet heart of this entire story," he said, "and I want to thank her, from the bottom of mine." He turned. So did everyone else, and all eyes landed on me. When the applause ended, I smiled. Small, controlled. I placed my hand gently over my chest as Noah raised his glass in my direction. A few heads turned to nod or glance at me with that vague look of admiration people reserve for strangers they've been told to respect. Ava didn't turn around. She stood beside Noah, dabbing her eyes, but her gaze never met mine. She didn't come over afterward either. I stayed seated at table 8 for the rest of the evening, surrounded by couples I didn't know, their laughter rising and falling like waves I couldn't catch. The music swelled, the champagne flowed, the dance floor came alive. Ava twirled in her gown, laughing with her in-laws, hugging Noah's sisters, kissing his mother on the cheek. Once she passed by me. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to smile and lift my glass an inch. She gave a brief nod, then turned away. I waited an hour, maybe more, for her to approach, for a thank you, a hug, a moment. It never came. At some point, someone announced cake. I stood, pretending I needed air. I stepped outside into the crisp night. The garden lights twinkled. Guests mingled under patio heaters. I walked past them unnoticed, down a narrow stone path lined with flickering lanterns, until I found a bench tucked beneath a jacaranda tree. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap, and let the night wrap around me. My feet ached from the tight shoes. My corsage was beginning to wilt. My smile, the one I'd worn all day, had finally faded. And there, under the tree, I let it hit me. Not just today, but everything. The slow fade of our relationship, the quiet rejection, the reshaping of her world until I no longer fit inside it. It wasn't anger that rose inside me. It wasn't even sadness anymore. It was a hollow kind of resignation. A soft acknowledgement that the version of motherhood I'd lived for so long was over. I pulled out my phone and looked at the time. 9:12 p.m. Still early for a wedding, but I'd had enough. I stood, dusted off my dress, and walked quietly back through the garden, past the glowing lanterns, past the joyful noise, past the rows of parked cars. I didn't go back inside. I didn't look for Ava. I didn't wait for dessert or photos or final words. I called a rideshare from the side of the road. The driver arrived in 5 minutes. "Big night?" he asked, glancing at my corsage in the rearview mirror. I nodded. Something like that. The car was warm. The city lights blurred past the windows. I sat quietly the whole way home, staring at my reflection in the glass. For a moment, I wondered what Ava would say when she realized I'd left. But then I stopped myself, because I wasn't sure she would notice. When I arrived home, the porch light was still on. I stepped inside, kicked off my heels, and sank into the couch in the living room. The silence felt clean, honest, like I could finally stop performing. I reached for the framed photo on the shelf, the one of Ava at age 9, her gap-toothed smile bright as she clutched her science fair ribbon. I looked at it for a long time. "I did my job," I whispered. Not perfectly, not always gracefully, but fully. I had loved her with everything I had. I gave her roots, and she had taken flight. Now it was time for me to land somewhere new. I didn't cry, not then. I just sat with the quiet, let it settle around me. And in that stillness, something inside me shifted. Not broken, not bitter, just released. The next morning, I poured myself a cup of tea, opened the curtains wide, and stood in the light. I wasn't anyone's guest anymore. I wasn't waiting for an invitation. I had walked away. And that was the first real choice I'd made for myself in a very long time. The days after the wedding passed in a fog. I thought walking away from the reception would bring clarity, maybe even a flicker of peace. But instead, I felt suspended. Not angry, not grieving, just empty. I moved through my routines like I was living in someone else's body. The house, once filled with echoes of bedtime stories and school mornings, now felt cavernous, too still, too quiet. I didn't hear from Ava. Not a text, not a call, not even a thank you for attending. I kept telling myself she was busy. The honeymoon, the afterglow, the chaos of post-wedding logistics. But the truth settled deeper with each passing day. I wasn't on her mind. The photo of us on the fireplace mantel, one taken at her college graduation, started to feel dishonest. She had her arms around me then, cheek pressed to mine, her eyes glinting with joy. I'd worn that same lavender cardigan she'd once asked me to stop wearing. I stared at it for a long time one night, then turned the frame face down. The hardest part wasn't that she forgot me, it was that I couldn't forget her. One Thursday morning, I found myself in the grocery store, standing in front of the tea shelf. My hands reached instinctively for the lemon ginger, her favorite. I placed it in the cart before catching myself. She didn't live here anymore. She didn't visit. She didn't even like tea now, she once told me. She drank cold brews and green juices and something called oat milk flat whites. I left the box in the cart and walked out of the store without buying anything. Later that afternoon, I sat by the window with my knitting needles in hand, but the yarn remained untouched in my lap. Outside, neighborhood kids raced past on scooters, their laughter piercing the silence. I used to hear that sound and smile. Now, it only reminded me of what had passed me by. That evening, I made dinner, roasted chicken and potatoes, but couldn't bring myself to eat. I sat at the table with the plate in front of me, the steam curling into the air untouched. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't full. I was just tired. After cleaning up, I wandered into the hallway closet and pulled out an old cardboard box. It was filled with Ava's childhood drawings, stick figures, glitter glue, crooked hearts with "I love you, Mommy" scribbled across them in crayon. One drawing showed the two of us under a giant yellow sun, holding hands. My hair was drawn as purple spaghetti, hers neon pink. I sat on the floor, that paper in my lap, and for the first time since the wedding, I wept. Not quietly, but in heaving, broken sobs that came from a part of me I hadn't accessed in years. My hands gripped the page so tightly it crumpled at the edges. I cried for the little girl I once knew, for the woman she had become, for all the space between us that no amount of mothering had been able to bridge. And then came the guilt. Had I loved her too much, smothered her, made her feel like she owed me something she never wanted to give? Had my sacrifices turned into invisible debts she resented paying? I didn't have answers, only questions that tore at me. Later that night, I crawled into bed without brushing my teeth. I stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. I couldn't remember the last time someone hugged me. Not out of obligation, but with real warmth, real love. I had given so much of myself to motherhood, I hadn't saved anything for me. That realization landed like a punch to the chest. I had built my identity around Ava, around being needed, and now that she didn't need me, who was I? I didn't sleep that night. I laid still, listening to the creaks of the house, the ticking of the old wall clock, the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The loneliness had taken root so deeply it felt like a second skin. By morning, my body ached in places I didn't know could ache. I stood in the mirror, my eyes swollen, my lips dry. I looked older than usual, not just from age, but from disappointment, from invisibility. That morning, I made a decision. Not dramatic, not defiant. Just this. I wasn't going to wait anymore. Not for a call, not for a thank you, not for her love to come back around. Something inside me had shattered completely, but maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new. 3 days after that sleepless night, I found myself cleaning. Not the usual surface-level tidying, but the kind of deep, relentless cleaning you do when your heart needs distraction. I emptied drawers, scrubbed behind furniture, took every book off the shelves. I told myself I was just reorganizing, but really, I was trying to find something, anything, that reminded me of who I was before I became invisible. In the hallway closet behind a row of old winter coats, I discovered a dusty plastic bin I hadn't opened in years. It was one of those bins you keep meaning to sort through, but never do. I pulled it out and carried it to the living room, setting it down in front of me like a forgotten time capsule. Inside were bits and pieces of a former life. Ava's old ballet shoes, a hand-drawn Mother's Day card, a few school report cards, and several small photo albums. I opened the one on top, and there we were. Ava, at 4 years old, in a fairy costume I made out of leftover curtain fabric. Me behind her, laughing, holding the wings straight so they wouldn't fall. Her smile was enormous. Mine was softer, tired maybe, but proud, always proud. I flipped slowly through the pages, feeling every moment as if it were stitched directly to my skin. Birthday parties, scraped knees, messy science projects, pages and pages of the life I gave her, and the identity I had let swallow me whole. And then I found it. Tucked in the back of the album, barely hanging on by a bent paperclip, was a folded letter. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. I didn't recognize it right away, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Ava's. I unfolded it with care. It was dated April 17th, 2011, her last year of high school. The ink was smudged in one corner as if her hand had trembled slightly as she wrote it. "Dear Mom," it began, "I don't say this enough, but I see you. I see everything you've done for me. Every night you stayed up while I studied, every lunch you skipped so I could go on that trip, every time you wore the same coat so I could have a new one. I see it all. I don't always show it, but I know how lucky I am to have a mom like you. You're the reason I believe I can make something of my life. You taught me how to stand tall. You never let me believe I was less than enough. I'm scared to leave home, but I'm going because you taught me how to be brave. That's what your love has always been. Quiet bravery. I promise I'll make you proud. No matter where I go, I'll always be yours. Love, Ava." I sat motionless for a long time, letter in hand, tears streaming silently down my cheeks. I had no memory of receiving this letter. Maybe she'd tucked it away and forgotten. Maybe she had written it, but never meant to send it. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that at one point, Ava had seen me. She had known what I gave her. That validation, so long overdue, rushed through me like a flood. I clutched the letter to my chest, letting my grief and gratitude spill together. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was enough to remind me I hadn't imagined everything. The connection we once had wasn't a lie. It had existed. It had been real. I carefully placed the letter in a clean frame and set it on the kitchen table. Every time I walked past it that day, I stopped and read a line. Each word landed like a balm on skin too raw to touch. That night, I made dinner again. Nothing elaborate, just soup and toast, but I ate every bite. I lit a candle. I put on music. I didn't do it for her. I did it for me. Because I was starting to remember someone I hadn't thought about in a long time, myself. I wasn't just someone's mother. I was Helen, a woman with a past, a voice, a life still waiting to be lived, and it took one forgotten letter to finally bring her back. The framed letter stayed on the kitchen table for days, then weeks. I didn't move it. I didn't try to hide it away like so many other reminders of what had been lost. Instead, I let it become part of my morning routine. I'd pour a cup of tea, sit at the table, and reread a few lines while the sun stretched across the tiled floor. And slowly, without effort, without ceremony, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden burst of confidence, no swelling music in the background. But one morning, I looked in the mirror and didn't flinch. My eyes were still tired, but they held something different now. Not pain, not defeat, a kind of recognition. I remembered this woman, not just as Ava's mother, but as Helen. For the first time in years, I started asking myself what I wanted. I began going for walks around the neighborhood every afternoon, not just to fill time, but to feel something. I watched the leaves change colors. I listened to the wind through the trees. I smiled at people passing by. I let myself slow down and be present, not out of obligation, but out of choice. I passed by a small bookstore one day, one I hadn't been inside since it opened. I lingered at the display window before walking in. The bell above the door jingled. The shop owner, a kind man named Theo, greeted me warmly. He asked if I was looking for anything in particular. "Not really," I said, "just something to remind me who I am." He nodded like he understood, and somehow, I think he did. I left with 2 novels and a poetry collection. That night, instead of numbing my thoughts with TV reruns, I read until midnight. I underlined lines that made me feel something. I scribbled notes in the margins. It felt like opening a window after being sealed inside for too long. A few days later, I cleaned out my bedroom closet. Not to hide things, but to rediscover them. I found an old sketchbook tucked behind a pile of winter scarves. I'd forgotten I used to draw. Not professionally, just little pencil portraits, often of Ava when she was young or things I saw in nature. I flipped through the pages. Some were rough, others surprisingly good. I set it on my nightstand. That weekend, I bought a fresh sketch pad and a new set of pencils. I sat on the porch and began drawing again. It was clumsy at first. My hand was stiff, my confidence thinner than tracing paper. But the more I drew, the more I felt like I was reconnecting with something sacred. Not who I used to be, but someone I had paused for too long. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, especially not to Ava. I didn't need her permission to feel whole. I started journaling, too. Just a few minutes every morning. I didn't write about her, not right away. I wrote about the way the light hit the table, about the birds nesting in the maple tree outside my window. I wrote about memories that had nothing to do with being a mother. Dancing barefoot in the kitchen when I was 23. The first time I ever rode a bike without falling. The taste of wild strawberries at a summer fair. Pieces of me began returning. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped obsessing over what I meant to someone else and started focusing on what I meant to myself. There was freedom in that. A soft, unannounced freedom. One morning, as I sat sketching in the park, a little girl ran by chasing bubbles. Her laugh was wild and full. Her mother called after her, flustered, tired, and smiling all at once. I remembered being that mother, and I felt something unexpected. Gratitude, not for the pain, but for the love that came before it. For the years I gave, and the strength I found in letting go. I wasn't healed, not yet, but I was awake, and that was the first step toward becoming someone new, someone I wanted to be. Once the fog began to lift, I didn't rush to announce my return to myself. I didn't send any messages to Ava. I didn't try to prove anything. I just lived differently, more carefully, more deliberately, like someone finally aware of her own quiet worth. My mornings became sacred. I'd wake before the world got loud, sit at the kitchen table with my tea and sketch pad, and draw whatever called to me. A vase, a window, a leaf. I didn't post the drawings online. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't doing it for approval. I was doing it because it soothed something inside me that had been ignored for far too long. I began volunteering twice a week at the local library. It wasn't glamorous, but it made me feel purposeful again. Helping a young boy find a book on sea creatures, assisting an elderly woman with the printer, talking about stories, not the ones I'd lived, but the ones I could escape into. It grounded me. One Thursday afternoon, while shelving returns, I overheard a group of teenage girls talking about college applications, how nervous they were, how expensive everything felt. I found myself stepping in gently. You know, I said, there's a scholarship fund from the local women's foundation. I think applications open next month. They turned, surprised. I wasn't just a quiet librarian. I was someone who knew things, someone they looked at with new respect. It had been years since I felt like I had something to offer outside of motherhood. That night, I went home and pulled out an old folder of resumes, dusty, outdated, but not dead. I updated mine slowly, not because I needed a full-time job, but because I wanted to remember who I'd been before my world shrank to one person. Helen Waverly, Massachusetts. In literature, former high school librarian, skilled in curriculum design, literacy programming, and child development, that woman still existed. I applied for a part-time consulting position with an educational nonprofit. Quietly, privately. I didn't even tell my closest friend, Liz. I didn't want advice. I didn't want encouragement. I just wanted to do it on my own. And that was the beauty of this chapter. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. I also began setting small boundaries. Not out loud, Not with arguments, but with calm decisions. When Ava finally did text me, 3 weeks after the wedding, asking how I was, I waited before responding. Not out of spite, just to give myself time to ask, what do I need before I step back into this conversation? I replied the next day. Doing well. Hope your honeymoon was lovely. Simple, honest, no apology, no eagerness, and I didn't ask to meet. I didn't extend an invitation. I let the silence sit, not as a punishment, but as a space for her to consider what came next. Meanwhile, I reconnected with Thomas, an old friend from years ago who now ran woodworking classes at the community center. We'd shared coffee once at a school fundraiser back when Ava was in 5th grade. I'd forgotten how easy he was to talk to. He invited me to one of his classes. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to go, but because it felt indulgent to do something just for fun. But I went, and I loved it. The smell of sawdust, the feel of carving tools in my hand, the simple satisfaction of creating something real. We didn't talk about Ava. We talked about music, movies, whether pine or cedar made a better cutting board. That night, walking back to my car, I realized how different I felt. Not better, not fixed, but fuller. Like I had roots of my own now. Ones not tangled in someone else's approval. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't waiting for a dramatic reunion. I was building a life. Slowly, steadily, where I didn't have to audition for love. In the past, my silence had meant pain, hurt, resentment, but now it meant strength. Every day I planted something small, a new habit, a rediscovered skill, a boundary, a joy. And I did it without needing Ava to notice. Because for the first time in decades, I wasn't living through her anymore. I was finally living for me. A few weeks passed, and I noticed something subtle begin to change, not in me, but in Ava. Her texts came more often now, little check-ins. Always careful and polite. Hey, just wanted to see how you're doing. Sent you a photo from the honeymoon. Thought you'd like it. Noah says hi. He's asking about that chicken recipe you used to make. I replied, but I didn't drop everything to respond. I answered on my time. I kept my tone warm, but no longer eager. I didn't offer plans. I didn't ask when I could visit. I let her feel my distance. Not in punishment, but in poise. And that distance had weight. When you've spent your life making yourself small for someone else's comfort, stepping back even an inch feels like a landslide. I was no longer the woman waiting by the phone. I was the woman with a full calendar, new friends, and evenings spent sketching or laughing in woodworking class. I didn't tell Ava any of this. I let my absence do the speaking. The silence spoke volumes. Then one Sunday, she called. Not texted. Called. I watched her name blink on the screen, and I hesitated before answering. Not out of spite, but because I needed to remind myself. I wasn't who I used to be. Hi, sweetheart, I said calmly. Hey, Mom, she replied. Her voice was a little shaky. I know it's been a while. I didn't rush to comfort her. I let the pause stretch. I've just been thinking a lot, she continued, about the wedding and how things played out. Still, I said nothing. I guess I didn't realize how that day might have felt for you, she added. That was the moment, the crack in the wall. Not an apology yet, but the beginning of awareness. I told her gently, I'm glad you're thinking about it. It's something I've carried. She was quiet on the other end. And I let her sit in that silence, the same silence I had once drowned in, but now it was mine, controlled, measured, powerful. I just wanted to say, she continued, that Noah's been talking about you a lot. He was kind of shocked when he realized where you were seated. He thought you'd be up front. I almost smiled. So did I. She didn't speak for a moment, then she sighed. I guess I messed that up, didn't I? There it was. Not a full apology, but an acknowledgement. And that was more than I ever expected. I didn't let emotion flood the space. I didn't rush in with reassurance. I stayed steady. It's behind us now, I said, but I've been doing some thinking too, about what I want the rest of my life to look like. That seemed to surprise her. Oh? Yes. I've started volunteering again, reconnecting with old friends, sketching, reading. I even took a woodworking class. There was a beat of stunned silence on her end. Then, wow, that's amazing. I heard something new in her voice. Not just surprise, but curiosity, maybe even admiration. It struck me how unfamiliar that tone was coming from her, and how long I had waited to hear it. In the weeks that followed, the shift deepened. Ava texted more. Her messages lost their stiffness. She asked real questions, not just check-ins. One day she wrote, "I've been thinking about that sketch pad you used to keep. Do you still draw?" I sent her a photo of a bird I'd drawn on my porch. She replied, "You're so talented, I forgot how good you are." That line sat with me for a long time. Forgot. Not didn't know, not never noticed. She had forgotten, because I had hidden those parts of myself in the shadows of motherhood, and now, in reclaiming them, I was slowly becoming someone she had to meet all over again. No drama, no confrontation, just a woman finding her way back into her own skin and letting her daughter feel the quiet shift in gravity. I didn't demand space, I simply took it. And in that space, the balance between us began to change, not through force, but through presence. Mine. It happened on a cool Saturday afternoon, just as the leaves were starting to turn. Ava texted that morning asking if I'd like to come by their place for a casual lunch. "No pressure," she wrote, "just us." It was the first invitation I'd received from her since the wedding. Not an obligatory holiday meal, not a forced brunch with her in-laws, just her and me. I stared at the message for a while before replying. Sure, I'd love to, but I didn't spend the next 3 hours agonizing over what to wear. I didn't rehearse what I might say. I didn't pin my self-worth to the shape the afternoon might take. I picked out a soft blue sweater I loved, put on my favorite earrings, the ones she gave me back in college, and left the house without checking my reflection twice. Their apartment was sleek and modern, much like Ava herself these days. Minimalist artwork, cream-colored walls, spotless countertops. Noah greeted me warmly at the door, giving me a gentle hug. He was the same, kind-eyed, steady, but Ava, she seemed nervous, or maybe unsure. Her smile was small, uncertain around the edges. She gestured for me to sit. There was lemon tea steeping on the counter. She remembered. We ate outside on the balcony. A few sandwiches, fruit. Nothing fancy. The sky was pale and clear, and for a while we made small talk. Her job, Noah's new project, the neighbor's barking dog. I nodded, smiled, offered polite replies, but something hung in the air between us. Something unspoken and heavy, like a curtain waiting to be drawn back. When the meal ended and Noah excused himself to take a call, we were left alone. Ava picked at the edge of her napkin, her fingers restless. Then finally, she looked at me. "I found something," she said quietly. I didn't speak. "In one of my old photo albums," she continued. "A letter I wrote you in high school. I don't even remember writing it." I nodded. "I found it too." Her eyes softened. "I don't know why I never gave it to you. I read it and it broke me. Because that girl, the one who wrote that, she knew everything. She saw you and I feel like I forgot who you were." Still, I waited. "I think I started rewriting the story of us somewhere along the way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself you were overbearing, that you wouldn't understand my life, that I needed space." "You did need space," I replied. "That's part of growing up." She looked down. "But I didn't have to erase you to take it." We sat in silence. Birds chirped somewhere in the distance. A breeze picked up, rustling the trees below. "You weren't at the front of the wedding," she said. "You weren't in the photos. You weren't honored." And I think I did that on purpose. Not out of cruelty, but because I didn't want to feel the weight of how much I owed you. I felt that sentence land, but I didn't rush to console her. I didn't say, "It's okay," because it hadn't been. Instead, I breathed in and out. "You don't owe me," I said calmly. "You never did. But you did forget me, and that hurt." Ava's eyes filled. "I know. I gave you everything I had," I continued, voice steady, "but I didn't do it for payback. I did it because I loved you. Because I still do. But I won't make myself small again to fit into your life. She nodded slowly. I don't want you to. I reached for my tea. Then let's begin again. As two women, not mother and child, but as people who are learning how to see each other clearly again. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. I'd like that. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. No shouting, no blame, just two voices meeting in a space cleared by truth, and that's what made it powerful. I left her apartment that afternoon without heaviness. No confusion, no regret. The truth had been spoken. Clearly, quietly, and without apology. I hadn't reclaimed my place in her life. I'd reclaimed myself and invited her to meet me there. I didn't expect what happened next. A few days after our conversation on the balcony, I received an envelope in the mail. Thick, ivory, with elegant lettering I didn't recognize. I opened it at the kitchen table, expecting it to be another wedding thank you card, or maybe a formal invitation from some relative of Noah's. Instead, it was a letter, handwritten, from Noah. Dear Helen, it began. I've been wanting to say this since the wedding, but I didn't want it to be rushed or swallowed by the noise of that day. So I'm writing now, with the time and clarity this deserves. He wrote about the first time he met Ava, how she told him stories of her mother, who raised her alone, who made costumes from nothing, who taught her how to fight for her place without ever needing to raise her voice. She painted you like a lighthouse, he wrote, strong, constant, luminous, in quiet ways. He explained that he had expected me to be front and center at the wedding, seated right beside Ava's new family. When he realized where I'd been placed, when he saw me from the altar nearly hidden in the middle rows, he said something inside him twisted. I looked for you afterward, he wrote. Ava said you left early, and when I asked why you were sitting so far back, she just said, it's better that way. But I knew it wasn't. Then came the part that surprised me most. Noah explained that after the wedding, he and Ava had a serious talk. Not just about the seating chart, but about what it reflected, the choices, the distance, the narrative Ava had built around me. She told me things I didn't know, he wrote, about how much you sacrificed, about the letter she found in the album, about the lunch you had together. And she cried, hard, because she realized she'd made you small to feel big. Then he said something I'll never forget. I asked her to do something, not for me, for you. Enclosed with the letter was a second envelope, smaller, sealed in gold wax. It had Ava's handwriting on the front. For you, from me. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling just a bit. Inside was a single photograph. Me. At the wedding. It was taken from behind Noah's shoulder during his speech. Everyone in the crowd turned toward me, eyes wide, expressions soft. I was the only one seated. My hand was resting over my heart, my eyes, wet but unbroken, looking back at him. And Ava had written on the back, "This is the moment I remembered who you are." Underneath the photo was a short note. "I gave this to the photographer after you left. I told him to frame it. I told him it was the only photo I needed from the wedding." I sat in silence for a long time. It wasn't a grand gesture. There were no crowds, no flowers, no dramatic breakdown. But it was justice. Not revenge, not repayment. Just truth, finally put in its rightful place. For years I had lived in the background, not because I belonged there, but because I let love convince me that sacrifice meant silence. And here, finally, was something different. A correction. Ava hadn't rewritten the past. She hadn't tried to excuse it. She had acknowledged it. And more than that, she had given me the one thing I never asked for, but always deserved, to be seen. I framed the photo and placed it beside the old one. The one of Ava with her missing tooth, her hand clutching mine. Side by side, they told a story. Of beginnings, of forgetting, of return. That night, I lit a candle, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat with both pictures in the soft golden light. No bitterness, no ache, just a quiet satisfaction. Not everyone gets their moment. Not everyone gets to witness the scales balance, even just for a breath. But I did. And that moment, captured forever, reminded me that the truth may be delayed, buried, or rewritten, but it cannot be erased. A week after the letter and photo arrived, Ava called again, not out of obligation this time, but from a place that sounded sincere. There was no pretense in her voice, no strained politeness, just the tentative warmth of a daughter trying to build a bridge she had once burned without realizing it. She asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. Nothing fancy, she promised. Just a meal, just us. I hesitated, not because I didn't want to go, but because I finally had choices. I no longer jumped at any opportunity to be included. Still, I said yes. And this time, I didn't spend the hours before wondering what to wear or how to act. I simply dressed in what I felt good in and brought along a small gift, a lemon loaf, like the ones I used to bake when she was little. When I arrived, Ava opened the door herself, barefoot, wearing a worn sweater that reminded me of her high school days. The apartment smelled of roasted vegetables and garlic. Noah greeted me like family, but it was Ava's embrace that caught me off guard. Long, steady, and for the first time in years, real. Dinner was warm, easy. We didn't tiptoe around the past. We didn't dissect the pain. Instead, she asked me about *me*, about my drawings, about the woodworking class. When I told her I was thinking about applying for a part-time library position again, she smiled, wide and proud. "That sounds perfect for you," she said, without hesitation. No criticism, no condescension. After dinner, we sat on the couch, flipping through old photo albums I'd brought over. She pointed to a photo of herself at age 5, dressed in a butterfly costume I'd made from recycled tulle and wire hangers. "I used to think this was the coolest thing ever," she laughed. "Still do." I smiled, not just because of the memory, but because she said it out loud. Then quietly, she asked, "Would you help me design the nursery?" I looked up. My heart did something I didn't expect. It fluttered. She was pregnant. She nodded, her eyes glassy. "I just found out a few days ago. We haven't told anyone else yet, but I wanted to tell you first." Tears sprang to my eyes, not just from joy, but from the significance. This wasn't just a reconciliation. This was an invitation to be part of something again, not out of guilt or routine, but out of choice. I reached across the couch and took her hand. I'd love to. We didn't say much else after that. We just sat together, two women who had once drifted into silence, now finding their way back through the ordinary warmth of shared space. She wasn't my little girl anymore, and I wasn't the mother who needed her approval to feel whole. But somehow, in this quiet reconnection, we were both exactly who we needed to be. Weeks later, on a crisp fall morning, I sat on my porch wrapped in a soft shawl, a sketch pad resting on my lap, and a warm mug of lemon tea in my hands. The trees had turned golden, the wind gently shaking loose a cascade of leaves that danced across the lawn like confetti. From a celebration no one needed to announce. Ava had just left after spending the afternoon painting nursery swatches in my kitchen. We laughed more than we worked. She told me she'd decided to hang the butterfly costume photo in the nursery, framed next to a picture of me holding her as a baby. "I want my child to know where they came from," she'd said, smiling, "to know who you are." The ache that had once lived in my chest, sharp, persistent, always humming in the background, was gone now, replaced not by perfection or complete healing, but by something stronger. Peace. I glanced down at the sketch pad, at the soft pencil lines forming a new drawing. A mother and child beneath a tree, hands intertwined, faces turned upward. It wasn't Ava and me, not exactly. It was every mother who had loved in silence, who had endured the ache of being forgotten, and who found her voice again. I didn't need to be front row anymore. I didn't need to be thanked in speeches or seen through someone else's lens to believe I mattered. I had rebuilt myself, in fragments, in silence, in quiet acts of returning. And the truth was, I liked the woman I'd become. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the wind carried the smell of distant fireplaces, I walked back inside and paused in the hallway. There, hanging on the wall, were the two framed photographs. One of Ava as a child, and the one of me at her wedding, hand over my heart, surrounded by strangers who finally looked at me. Really looked. I touched the frame gently. "I see you," I whispered. Not to the photo, not to Ava, to myself, to the woman who had waited so long to be seen. And finally was.